The town of Maplewood, Ohio, had a way of making people feel like nothing bad could ever really happen there. It was the kind of place where neighbors still waved from their porches, where kids drew chalk pictures on the sidewalk until the streetlights came on, and where the biggest news of any given week was usually the results of the Friday night high school football game. Streets lined with oak trees. A little downtown with a bakery that smelled like cinnamon every single morning. A community that had, for decades, managed to stay just outside the reach of the kind of darkness that existed in other places, bigger places, harder places. That illusion shattered on the afternoon of October 14th. It began, as so many devastating things do, without any warning at all. No argument echoing down the block, no crash of broken glass, no raised voices cutting through the autumn air. There was simply a moment when everything was ordinary, and then a moment when it wasn't. The transition between those two moments was so quiet, so completely without drama, that most of Maplewood didn't even notice it had happened until the sirens arrived. It was 63-year-old Eleanor Watts who first called 911. Eleanor lived directly across the street from the pale yellow house at 412 Birchwood Lane, and she had a habit of sitting on her front porch in the late afternoons with a cup of chamomile tea and a paperback novel she almost never actually read. She preferred watching the neighborhood, not out of nosiness. She always insisted, but out of a lifelong belief that paying attention to the people around you was simply good citizenship. That afternoon, her attention was drawn to the small figure she could see through the gaps in the wooden fence, separating the yard next door from her own view. A child sitting alone, completely still. Eleanor watched for several minutes, expecting an adult to appear, a mother calling from the back door, a voice asking the little one to come inside for dinner, but no voice came. The child didn't move, didn't look around, didn't play. Just sat in the dry autumn grass with something pressed against her chest, staring at nothing in particular with an expression that made Eleanor's heart do something strange and uncomfortable inside her chest. She set down her tea. She set down her book. And she picked up her phone. When the first patrol car turned onto Birchwood Lane, Officer Daniel Marsh was behind the wheel. He was 28 years old, just 3 years into the job, and he later admitted to colleagues that nothing in his training had prepared him for what he found when he pushed open the unlocked gate of the backyard at 412. The yard was ordinary enough, a rusted swing set in the corner, a deflated basketball near the fence, a scattering of leaves that nobody had gotten around to raking. And in the center of it all, sitting cross-legged in the grass like she had been placed there very carefully and told not to move, was a little girl who could not have been more than 3 years old. She had dark curly hair pulled into 2 uneven pigtails. She was wearing a pink long-sleeved shirt with a cartoon cat on the front, a pair of purple leggings, and one shoe, her left foot bare and slightly dirty, as though the right shoe had been lost somewhere in whatever had happened before Officer Marsh arrived. In her arms, pressed so tightly against her small chest that her knuckles had gone pale, was a stuffed rabbit, soft gray, one ear slightly longer than the other, worn at the seams in the way that only a truly beloved toy ever gets. Her eyes were open and brown and completely, utterly vacant. Officer Marsh crouched down several feet away from her. He spoke softly, the way he might speak to a frightened animal. He said hello. He told her his name. He said she was safe now, that everything was okay, that nobody was going to hurt her. He watched her face carefully for any flicker of response, a blink, a twitch, a shift in her gaze. There was nothing. It was as though the words were reaching her from a very great distance, traveling through layers and layers of something dense and impenetrable, and arriving, by the time they got to her, as nothing more than sound without meaning. Paramedic James Crowley arrived 6 minutes later. James had been doing this job for 15 years. He had pulled people from car wrecks and house fires. He had held the hands of strangers in the worst moments of their lives and kept his composure through things that visited him later in his sleep. He liked to believe he had developed, over time, a certain professional armor, a calm that allowed him to function when everything around him was falling apart. That armor, he would tell his wife later that evening, sitting at their kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, had not been enough for this. It wasn't fear on her face, he said quietly. Fear, I know, fear looks like something. This was different. It was like she had already gone somewhere else. Somewhere inside herself where whatever had happened couldn't reach her anymore, and she had decided to stay there. Lily Monroe, because that, investigators would soon learn was her name, was transported to Riverside Children's Hospital, where a full medical examination confirmed that she had not sustained any physical injuries. No broken bones, no bruises, no marks of any kind. The doctors who examined her used the word physically unharmed in their reports, and technically, medically, that was accurate. But everyone in that hospital room who looked into Lily's eyes that night understood that the word unharmed was doing a great deal of heavy lifting, because something had happened to this child. Something that had reached inside a 3-year-old girl on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a quiet Ohio neighborhood, and turned off a light that should have been burning bright for decades still to come. The house at 412 Birchwood Lane was empty. No adults, no explanation, no note. Just a little girl with one shoe, a worn stuffed rabbit, and a silence so complete and so heavy that it seemed to fill every room she entered. The investigation had not yet begun. The courtroom was months away. Rex did not yet exist in Lily's world. But the story, the one that would eventually stop a courtroom cold and remind an entire county what genuine courage looked like, had already started. It had started the moment Alina Watts put down her tea and picked up her phone. Detective Sandra Reyes had seen the inside of more crime scenes than she could count. 20 years on the Franklin County Sheriff's Office had taken her through drug raids and domestic disputes, through cold cases that kept her awake at 3 a.m. and courtroom victories that made every difficult morning worth it. She had a reputation among her colleagues for being unshakable, the kind of investigator who walked into chaos and immediately began organizing it into something manageable. Her desk was always clean. Her case files were always color-coded. Her coffee was always black, and she drank it without ever seeming to need it, as though the caffeine was purely ceremonial. She was halfway through a Tuesday evening report when her phone rang. By the time she pulled up to 412 Birchwood Lane, the street was already crowded with patrol cars, a paramedic unit pulling away toward the hospital, and Alina Watts standing on her porch across the street with both arms wrapped around herself, despite the fact that the evening wasn't particularly cold. Detective Reyes noted all of it in a single sweeping glance as she stepped out of her car. She noted the pale yellow house, the unlocked front door standing slightly open, the single child's shoe sitting in the middle of the front walkway like a small pink punctuation mark on a sentence nobody had finished writing yet. She put on her gloves and stepped inside. The house at 412 Birchwood Lane told a story, the way all houses do when something goes wrong inside them. It told it not through destruction or violence. There was none of that, but through the specific and unsettling language of interruption. A pan on the stove with the burner still on low, a small portion of macaroni and cheese beginning to dry and stick to the bottom. A cartoon playing on the living room television, the cheerful animated voices completely indifferent to the emptiness of the room they were performing for. A child's sippy cup on the coffee table, half full of apple juice, a ring of condensation forming slowly beneath it on the wood. A woman's purse on the kitchen counter, wallet inside, phone inside, keys hanging on the hook beside the door. Nobody leaves their keys, Detective Reyes thought. Nobody leaves in a hurry and forgets their keys unless they didn't have a choice about the hurrying. She moved through every room methodically, her eyes cataloging details the way they had been trained to do, not searching for what was there, but for what wasn't, what was missing, what had been removed, what the absence of things was saying just as loudly as the presence of others. A child's bedroom with a small toddler bed shaped like a racing car, stuffed animals arranged along the windowsill with care, a mobile of paper stars hanging from the ceiling. On the dresser, a framed photograph, a young woman with dark curly hair smiling at the camera, a laughing toddler on her hip. The woman's name, Detective Reyes would learn within the hour, was Angela Monroe, 26 years old, Lily's mother, and as of that evening, completely missing. The investigation expanded rapidly, the way serious cases do when the first 24 hours feel like a clock ticking in the walls. A team of officers canvassed Birchwood Lane door to door, collecting statements from neighbors who had seen varying degrees of nothing. A woman 2 houses down thought she might have heard a car door around mid-afternoon, but couldn't be certain. A teenage boy across the alley said he'd seen a dark SUV parked near the house a couple of times that week, but hadn't paid much attention. Eleanor Watts, who had paid more attention than anyone, confirmed that she had not seen Angela Monroe leave the house that day, and had not heard anything unusual before noticing Lily alone in the yard. Security footage was pulled from a convenience store 3 blocks away, a doorbell camera on the corner house, and the ATM outside the bank on the main road. Analysts began the slow, frame-by-frame work of looking for faces, license plates, timestamps, any thread that might lead somewhere. Meanwhile, Angela Monroe's background was being assembled piece by piece. She had grown up in Columbus, moved to Maplewood 18 months earlier, worked part-time at a dental office on Clement Avenue. Her coworkers described her as quiet, reliable, and devoted to her daughter. No criminal record, no history of disappearing, no indication of any lifestyle that might explain why she had vanished from her own kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon, leaving macaroni on the stove and her child alone in the backyard. But there was a name. There is almost always a name. It surfaced first from Angela's coworker, a woman named Tanya Brooks, who mentioned it carefully and with visible discomfort during her interview, the way people mention names they wish they didn't know. Marcus Webb, 41 years old, a man Angela had apparently been seeing briefly several months earlier, a relationship she had ended and, according to Tanya, had been trying to keep ended ever since. Tanya described 2 incidents at the dental office, once when Marcus had shown up unannounced and Angela had asked the receptionist to say she wasn't in, and once when Tanya herself had walked Angela to her car after a late shift because Angela had seemed nervous about going alone. She never said he hurt her, Tanya told Detective Reyes carefully, but she was afraid of him. I could see it. Marcus Webb had a history, not a long one, not a lurid one, but enough. A restraining order filed and later dropped by a former girlfriend in Summit County 3 years earlier. A disorderly conduct charge from a bar altercation that had been pleaded down to nothing. A pattern Detective Reyes recognized immediately that was frustratingly common. A man who existed just inside the edges of what the law could formally touch, leaving behind a trail of frightened women and dropped charges in situations that never quite became cases. She put his name at the top of her whiteboard. But naming a suspect and building a case were 2 entirely different things, and Detective Reyes knew it better than anyone. The evidence connecting Marcus Webb to 412 Birchwood Lane that Tuesday afternoon was circumstantial at best. No witnesses had placed him at the scene. No physical evidence had yet tied him directly to the house. Angela Monroe had not been found. And the one person who had been present, the one small, dark-haired, curly-headed person who had been sitting in that backyard with one shoe and a stuffed rabbit and eyes that had gone somewhere unreachable, had not spoken a single word to anyone since Officer Marsh first crouched beside her in the grass. Dr. Michelle Owens submitted her assessment to the department on the 4th day of the investigation. It was thorough, compassionate, and ultimately delivered news that Detective Reyes had already suspected, but had hoped not to hear confirmed so definitively. Lily Monroe was experiencing what Dr. Owens described as acute trauma-induced selective mutism, a condition in which the psychological impact of a witnessed or experienced event effectively suppresses the ability to communicate, particularly with authority figures or in high-stress environments. It was not permanent, Dr. Owens was careful to note. It was not untreatable. But it required patience, safety, and an approach to engagement that bore absolutely no resemblance to a standard investigative interview. "This child cannot be questioned," Dr. Owens wrote in her final paragraph. "She must be reached. Those are two very different things, and confusing one for the other will only cause further harm." Detective Reyes read that paragraph 3 times. Then she leaned back in her chair, stared at the whiteboard with Marcus Webb's name at the top, and thought about the gap between those two words, questioned and reached, and how wide it felt, and how she was going to have to find a way across it. She didn't yet know that the bridge would have 4 legs and a golden coat, an answer to the name Rex. But she was about to find out. Patricia Hollies had worked as a volunteer coordinator for the Cuyahoga County Courthouse for 11 years, and in that time she had developed a very particular skill that nobody had ever formally trained her in, and nobody had ever officially recognized on her personnel file. She knew how to read a room. More specifically, she knew how to read the people inside a room, the ones who were holding themselves together by a thread so thin it was nearly invisible, the ones who had walked through the courthouse doors carrying something so heavy that it had changed the way they moved through the world. She had seen hundreds of them over the years. Victims and witnesses and grieving families and frightened children, all of them navigating a system that was designed, at its core, around procedure and evidence and legal argument rather than around the simple and urgent human need to feel safe. It was that instinct, that 11 years of quietly watching people navigate impossible situations, that made Patricia pick up the phone on a gray Wednesday morning and call Detective Sandra Reyes. She had heard about Lily through the courthouse grapevine, the way information about sensitive cases sometimes traveled in careful whispers between departments that needed to coordinate without compromising anything. She knew the basics: a little girl, a missing mother, a suspect with a name but not yet enough evidence to bury him, and a child so locked inside her own silence that every conventional attempt to reach her had come back empty. Patricia had heard Dr. Owens' assessment secondhand, and had spent 2 days turning it over in her mind before she arrived at the idea. She was now preparing to present to a detective she had never personally met. She expected resistance. She got curiosity instead, which was better. Detective Reyes listened without interrupting as Patricia explained Rex, who he was, what he did, how he worked, and why she believed, with a conviction that went beyond professional opinion into something closer to certainty, that he was exactly what Lily needed. She slid a photograph across the desk. Rex looked back from it with the particular expression that golden retrievers seem to have perfected over centuries of existing beside human beings, open, warm, entirely without agenda. His orange facility vest was neat and bright against his golden fur. His eyes held the kind of patience that most people spend entire lifetimes trying to cultivate and rarely fully achieve. Detective Reyes studied the photograph for a long moment. "A dog," she said finally. It wasn't a question and it wasn't a dismissal. It was the sound of a very practical person genuinely considering something she hadn't considered before. Patricia waited. "Bring him in," the detective said. Rex had come into the world on a farm in rural Pennsylvania, the third of a litter of 8, selected at 8 weeks old by a trainer named Howard Bell, who had been placing facility and therapy dogs with courthouses, hospitals, and crisis centers for over 2 decades. Howard had an eye for the right animal the way some people have an ear for music, instinctive, immediate, and almost impossible to fully explain to anyone who didn't share it. He saw something in Rex within the first hour of meeting him, not just the temperament, though the temperament was exceptional, something quieter than that, a quality of presence that Howard had only encountered a handful of times in 30 years of working with dogs. Some dogs comfort people by being energetic and warm, Howard once explained to a journalist writing a piece about facility animals. They bring brightness into a room. Rex does something different. Rex brings stillness, and sometimes stillness is the only thing that actually works. Rex had spent 2 years in formal training before being placed with the Cuyahoga County Courthouse program. He learned to walk calmly through crowded, noisy environments without reacting. He learned to remain composed when people cried loudly or moved unpredictably. He learned to approach slowly, to wait, to never push himself on anyone, to read the signals that people gave off consciously and unconsciously, and respond to them with a sensitivity that went so far beyond standard animal behavior that it occasionally made people who worked with him feel slightly awed. He had sat beside a 17-year-old boy testifying about a violent assault and had somehow known, without any signal from his handler, to shift his body so that the boy could press his shoulder against Rex's side without it being visible to the courtroom. He had lain quietly at the feet of a woman, reliving the worst experience of her life on the witness stand for 4 hours without moving, without making a sound, without doing anything except being there in a way that the woman later described as the only reason she had been able to stay in that room. Patricia Hollies brought Rex to the courthouse meeting room on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks into Lily's silence. The room had been prepared carefully. Soft lighting, a low table with a few picture books and some crayons set out casually, as though they had simply been left there rather than deliberately arranged. A small bowl of water for Rex in the corner. No medical equipment, no official-looking clipboards, no adults in uniforms. Just a room that was trying, as hard as a room can try, to feel like nowhere in particular. Lily arrived holding Bun Bun with both arms and Carol Simmons's hand with 2 fingers, the minimal grip of a child who wanted the option of letting go quickly. She stopped in the doorway and scanned the room the way she had scanned every room since October 14th. Carefully, thoroughly, looking for something that Detective Reyes's colleagues had started quietly referring to as the thing Lily checks for, though none of them could precisely define what that thing was. Whatever she was looking for, she either didn't find it or found enough of its absence to feel marginally safer, because she stepped inside. Rex was already in the room. He had entered 2 minutes earlier and positioned himself near the center, and he was now lying on his side on the soft rug with the particular boneless relaxation of a dog who has decided that the floor is an excellent place to spend some time. He was not looking at the door. He was not looking at Lily. He appeared, to any observer, to be primarily interested in a spot on the ceiling. Lily saw him immediately. Something happened in her face that Dr. Owens, watching from behind the one-way glass, would later spend 3 paragraphs trying to describe in her clinical notes and ultimately summarize with a single word: recognition. Not recognition of Rex specifically, she had never seen him before, but recognition of something he represented. Something safe. Something that existed outside the category of things that had hurt her, or failed her, or left her alone in a backyard with one shoe, and a silence she couldn't climb out of. For 11 minutes nobody moved. Rex breathed slowly on the rug. Lily stood near the doorway watching him. Carol waited in the hall. Dr. Owens barely breathed behind her glass. And then Lily let go of Carol's fingers completely. She walked across the room, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with the careful, deliberate steps of someone who has made a decision and is following through on it, and she lowered herself onto the rug beside Rex. She didn't hug him. She didn't pet him in the enthusiastic way that children typically approach dogs. She simply sat down beside him and leaned her small body against his warm, golden side and closed her eyes. Rex lifted his head once, looked at her for a moment with those calm brown eyes, and then set his chin back down on the rug. Patricia Hollies, standing in the hallway with Carol Simmons, pressed both hands over her mouth. Carol made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but landed somewhere in the complicated territory between the two. Detective Reyes, who had stopped by to observe and was standing slightly apart from the others with her arms folded, and her jaw set in the way it always was when she was trying to keep her face professional, turned toward the window and looked at the ceiling for a moment before turning back. Nobody said anything, because some moments are bigger than whatever words you could put around them, and the people in that hallway understood instinctively that speaking would be like turning on a light in a room where something delicate was finally, carefully beginning to grow. Lily sat against Rex for 40 minutes that first morning. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She had simply found the first safe thing in her world since October 14th, and she was not letting go of it. The second morning came with a thin frost on the courthouse windows and a sky the color of worn pewter. Carol Simmons arrived early, Lily's hand in hers, Bun tucked under Lily's arm in the particular sideways grip that had become as familiar to Carol as her own reflection. Lily had slept better the previous night than she had since coming to Carol's home, not well, not peacefully, not without the small sounds that escaped her in the dark hours that Carol had learned to listen for from the next room. But better, measurably, undeniably better. Carol had noted it in the simple, honest language of a woman who paid close attention to small things. Lily had eaten a full piece of toast at breakfast. She had looked out the kitchen window at a bird on the fence for almost a full minute. She had, very briefly, almost smiled. Dr. Michelle Owens was already in her observation position when they arrived, her notepad open, her pen uncapped, her coffee untouched and going cold on the small table beside her chair. She had spent the previous evening reviewing her notes from the first session with the specific focus of someone searching for patterns. The precise moment Lily's body language had shifted, the angle at which she had approached Rex, the quality of the stillness that had settled over her once she made contact. Dr. Owens had been working with traumatized children for 16 years. She had published papers. She had testified as an expert witness. She had sat across from children who carried things inside them that no child should ever have to carry, and she had helped many of them, slowly and imperfectly, find their way back toward something resembling themselves. But she had never seen anything move as fast as Lily moved toward Rex. In clinical terms, what was happening between Lily and the dog was explainable. Animals, and dogs in particular, represented a category of relationship that existed entirely outside the framework of threat that trauma had built inside Lily's mind. Rex made no demands. He issued no instructions. He carried no authority that needed to be feared or navigated. He did not look at Lily with the particular mixture of concern and urgency that every adult face had worn since October 14th, that expression which, however well-intentioned, communicated to a traumatized child that something was still very wrong and that she was at the center of it. Rex simply existed beside her, warm, steady, breathing, present without pressure. It was, Dr. Owens wrote in her notes, the purest form of safe relationship that Lily's damaged nervous system was currently capable of accepting. In human terms, what was happening was simpler and more profound than any clinical framework could fully hold. Lily had found a friend. The sessions followed a rhythm that developed organically over the first week, shaped not by any formal schedule but by what Lily herself seemed to need each day. Some mornings she arrived and went straight to Rex with the focused intention of someone completing an important task. Other mornings she circled the room first, touching things, the spines of the picture books, the edge of the table, the soft curtain fabric near the window, as though she needed to map the space before she could settle into it. Rex waited every time without any sign of impatience, watching her with those calm brown eyes from whatever position he had arranged himself in, his tail doing its single slow wag when she finally came close enough for him to feel her warmth. On the third day, Lily laughed. It happened over nothing in particular. Rex had shifted his position on the rug in the abrupt, slightly undignified way that large dogs sometimes do, his legs going in 4 different directions briefly before he resettled, and something about it caught Lily by surprise. The laugh was small and quickly swallowed, barely more than a bright exhale, but it was unmistakably, genuinely real. Dr. Owens wrote the word in her notes and then underlined it twice. Laughter. Behind the glass, Patricia Hollies touched her own face and found that she was smiling so hard her cheeks ached. On the 5th day, Lily began to whisper. Not to the adults in the room, not to Carol, who sat quietly near the door during sessions, available but unobtrusive, not to Dr. Owens, who continued to observe from behind her glass, not to anyone who could respond in language, who could ask follow-up questions, who existed within the complicated and frightening category of people who needed things from Lily that she didn't yet know how to give. She whispered to Rex. Specifically, she whispered into the fur behind his left ear, which had become her preferred location, a spot she had apparently identified and claimed somewhere in the first 2 days as the correct place for private communication. Nobody could hear what she said in those early whispers. The microphone in the room picked up the sound of her voice, but not the words, just the soft, rhythmic murmur of a child telling a dog things that she was not yet ready to tell the world. Dr. Owens made careful notes about the frequency and duration of the whispering without straining to interpret the content. The content, she believed, would come when it was ready. The important thing, the clinically significant, genuinely remarkable thing, was that Lily was using language again. Directed language, intentional communication. The wall was not down, but somewhere in it, a door had opened by exactly 1 inch. On the 7th day, Lily introduced Rex to Bun Bun. This was not a casual event. It was conducted with the full ceremonial gravity that 3-year-olds bring to matters they consider important, which is to say with complete seriousness, and an attention to protocol that would have been at home in a formal diplomatic setting. Lily held Bun Bun up in front of Rex's face and said, in a clear and deliberate voice that made every adult in the building go very still, the first words anyone had heard her speak aloud since October 14th, "This is Bun Bun. He is my friend. You can be his friend too." Rex sniffed Bun Bun with appropriate solemnity. His tail wagged once. Lily nodded, apparently satisfied that the introduction had gone well, and tucked Bun Bun under her arm again. Behind the glass, Dr. Owens had stopped writing entirely. She was simply watching, her pen suspended above the notepad, her professional composure engaged in a quiet but vigorous battle with something much less professional that was pushing up behind her eyes. By the 8th day, the whispers had grown longer and the door in the wall had opened a little wider. The microphone was picking up fragments now, single words, partial phrases, the edges of sentences that dissolved before they could be fully captured. Carol reported that Lily had asked, the previous evening at dinner, whether Rex liked macaroni and cheese, and had seemed genuinely concerned about his dietary preferences in a way that suggested she was thinking about him outside of their sessions. She had also, Carol mentioned with careful casualness, asked once whether Rex ever got scared. Carol had said she didn't know. Lily had considered this for a moment and then said quietly, "I could tell him it's okay." Detective Reyes, reading Carol's daily report over her morning coffee, set the mug down and read that last sentence 3 more times. It was on the 11th day that everything changed again. Dr. Owens had stepped into the hallway briefly to confer with a colleague when her assistant grabbed her arm and pointed back toward the observation room with an expression that communicated urgency without words. The microphone in the playroom had picked up something new. Not a fragment this time, not the edge of a sentence dissolving into silence. A complete thought, delivered clearly and directly into the fur behind Rex's left ear, in the small, steady voice of a child who had decided, apparently, that this particular thing was too important to whisper around. 4 words. He came inside Rex. Dr. Owens stood in the doorway of the observation room and listened to the recording played back twice. Her colleague stood beside her without speaking. Down the hall, someone went to find Detective Reyes. Reyes arrived in 4 minutes, still holding her coffee, and listened to the playback with her eyes fixed on the window that looked into the room where Lily sat peacefully beside Rex, her hand resting on his back, looking at a picture book with the particular focused concentration of a child who has said what needed to be said and is now ready to move on to other things. Detective Reyes set her coffee down on the nearest flat surface. She straightened her jacket. She looked through the window for a long moment at a 3-year-old girl and a golden dog sitting together in a patch of morning light, and something moved across her face that the people around her would later describe, each in their own words, as the expression of someone watching a locked door begin, very slowly, to open. "She's going to talk," Detective Reyes said quietly, not as a question, not as a hope, as a statement of fact delivered by someone who had just watched something shift irreversibly in the direction of the truth. She was right. The debate inside the Franklin County Prosecutor's office lasted 11 days. 11 days of closed-door meetings, raised voices, carefully worded legal memos, and long silences that settled over conference tables like weather. Assistant District Attorney Kevin Marsh, no relation to Officer Daniel Marsh, who had first found Lily in the backyard, had been prosecuting serious cases for 14 years, and he had never once in those 14 years found himself in the position of building a significant portion of his strategy around the potential testimony of a 3-year-old child. The legal, ethical, and psychological dimensions of what was being proposed sat on his desk in 3 separate folders, each one thick with documentation, expert opinion, and cautionary precedent. And every morning when he arrived at the office, he opened all 3 and read them again, as though the answer he needed might have appeared overnight while he was sleeping. The core question was not whether Lily had something important to say. After the recording of those 4 words, he came inside Rex, and the sessions that followed in which the fragments of Lily's account had slowly, carefully, and incompletely emerged through Dr. Owen's painstaking therapeutic work. There was no serious doubt that Lily Monroe had witnessed something relevant to the case against Marcus Webb. The question, the one that kept Kevin Marsh awake and kept the conference room filled with competing opinions, was whether placing her in a courtroom, even under the most compassionate and carefully controlled conditions imaginable, was something that could be done without causing her further harm. Dr. Owens was consulted at length. Her position was measured and precise in the way that her positions always were, not a blanket endorsement and not a blanket refusal, but a carefully drawn map of conditions under which she believed Lily's participation could be managed safely. Rex would need to be present throughout. The environment would need to be modified from standard courtroom configuration in specific ways. Lily would not be subjected to aggressive cross-examination. The duration of her time on or near the stand would be strictly limited, and critically, the decision to proceed or withdraw at any point would rest with Dr. Owens and Carol Simmons, not with the legal team, not with the judge, and not with the needs of the case. Kevin Marsh accepted every condition without negotiation. He had daughters of his own. Judge Carol Harmon reviewed the motion and the supporting documentation over a weekend and issued her ruling on a Monday morning in language that was precise and compassionate in equal measure. The court would accommodate Lily Monroe's participation under the conditions outlined by Dr. Owens. Rex would be permitted in the courtroom. Modifications to the witness area would be approved. Standard cross-examination protocols would be suspended for this witness. The defense objected, as expected, through a motion that argued Lily's presence would be inherently prejudicial regardless of what she said or didn't say. Judge Harmon denied the motion with a thoroughness that left very little room for the defense to revisit the argument. The date was set 3 weeks away, and then 2, and then 1. Carol Simmons did not tell Lily about the courtroom in advance. This was Dr. Owens' recommendation, carefully explained and followed precisely. Children of Lily's age did not benefit from extended anticipatory periods around stressful events, and the risk of Lily spending 3 weeks building anxiety around something she couldn't fully conceptualize outweighed the benefit of preparation time. Instead, Carol was given specific language to use on the morning itself. Simple, honest, and framed entirely around Rex, rather than around courts or judges or defendants, or any of the adult architecture of the situation Lily was being asked to walk into. The morning arrived in February, cold and steel gray, the kind of morning that felt serious before anything had even happened in it. Carol was up before her alarm. She made Lily's favorite breakfast, scrambled eggs with the edges slightly crispy, the way Lily inexplicably preferred them, and apple juice in the cup with the yellow stars on it. She laid out Lily's yellow sweater, the one with the small embroidered sunflowers along the collar that Lily had chosen herself from a rack at the department store 3 weeks earlier and had been deeply committed to ever since. She brushed Lily's dark curls and braided them with a pale blue ribbon that caught the morning light in the kitchen. Lily ate her eggs with the focused efficiency of someone with a schedule to keep. She drank her apple juice. She retrieved Bun Bun from the living room couch where he spent his nights and tucked him under her arm. Then she looked up at Carol with those dark brown eyes that had come so far from the vacant, dimmed expression of the backyard on October 14th, eyes that were present now, alert, carrying the particular intelligence of a child who understands more than the adults around her always realize. And she said, "Are we going to see Rex today?" Carol felt the question move through her chest like something physical. "Yes, baby," she said. "We're going to see Rex." Lily nodded once, with the decisive satisfaction of someone whose most important question has been answered, and went to get her coat. The drive to the courthouse took 22 minutes. Lily sat in her car seat with Bun Bun in her lap and watched the city move past the window, the bare winter trees, the storefronts with their lights just coming on in the gray morning, the people on sidewalks moving quickly with their shoulders hunched against the cold. Carol watched her in the rearview mirror more than she watched the road, cataloging her with the careful attention of someone responsible for something irreplaceable. Lily seemed calm. Not the hollow, disconnected calm of the backyard, but something different, something that sat more quietly inside her, less like absence and more like stillness. "Carol," Lily said at one point, without looking away from the window. "Yes, sweetheart." A pause. Outside, a dog was being walked on a leash by an elderly man in a red coat, trotting along the sidewalk with its tail up. "Rex is a good boy," Lily said. Carol kept her eyes on the road. "He really is," she said. Nothing more was said for the rest of the drive. The courthouse was already alive with a particular energy when they arrived, the kind that builds in public buildings when something significant is about to happen, and the people inside all know it even if they aren't directly involved. Reporters had gathered near the entrance in a cluster that Carol navigated quickly, keeping her body between Lily and the cameras with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this for weeks. Security staff parted for them with quiet professionalism. A victim's advocate named Rosa, who had been part of Lily's support team since the early weeks, met them in the lobby and walked with them through the back corridor toward the designated preparation room. The courthouse hallways were different from how they usually felt on an ordinary Wednesday. Quieter somehow, despite the number of people moving through them. Or perhaps not quieter, perhaps simply more aware of themselves, more weighted with the knowledge of what was scheduled to happen in courtroom 4 in less than 2 hours. Officers who passed them in the corridor nodded to Carol with expressions that communicated something beyond standard professional courtesy. A clerk who had seen Lily during the Rex sessions stopped in the hallway and pressed her hand briefly to her own heart as they passed, a gesture so spontaneous and unguarded that Carol had to look away. Detective Sandra Reyes was waiting outside the preparation room. She was dressed more formally than Carol had seen her before, a dark blazer, her hair pulled back, the particular composure of someone who had prepared themselves very deliberately for a significant day. She crouched down when she saw Lily, bringing herself to the child's eye level with the ease of someone who had been doing it long enough that it no longer required thought. "Good morning, Lily," she said. Lily regarded her for a moment with the evaluative seriousness that she brought to most adult interactions. Then she held up Bun Bun. "Bun Bun came too," she said. Detective Reyes looked at the worn, stuffed rabbit with an expression that she would have been embarrassed to have described accurately. "Good," she said, with complete sincerity. "We need him here." Inside the preparation room, Rosa read Lily a picture book while Carol spoke quietly with Dr. Owens in the corner, running through the checklist of conditions and contingencies one final time. Through the wall, faintly, came the sounds of the courthouse preparing itself: footsteps, muffled voices, the distant thud of a heavy door. Lily turned pages and asked Rosa questions about the pictures with the unhurried curiosity of a child at a library on a Saturday morning. And then the door opened, and Patricia Hollies leaned her head inside. "Rex is ready," she said. Lily looked up from the book. Something moved across her face, not excitement exactly and not quite relief, but the particular expression of a child arriving at the thing they have been quietly moving toward all morning without fully nomming it. She closed the book carefully. She stood up. She tucked Bun Bun firmly under her arm. She looked at Carol. Carol nodded. And Lily Monroe, 3 years old, in a yellow sweater with sunflowers on the collar and a pale blue ribbon in her braided hair, walked toward the door of Courtroom 4 with the steady, unhurried steps of someone who had already, in the most important way, made up her mind. Courtroom 4 of the Franklin County Courthouse was not a particularly large room by judicial standards. It held a gallery of perhaps 60 seats, a jury box with 14 chairs, a judge's bench elevated just enough to remind everyone in the room of the authority it represented, and the particular atmosphere that courtrooms develop over years of absorbing the weight of human consequence. A heaviness that lived in the wood of the benches, and the grain of the floor and the quality of the air itself. As though the walls had been slowly absorbing every serious thing ever spoken inside them and had grown dense with it over time. On an ordinary Wednesday morning it was a professional space, functional, impersonal, designed for procedure rather than comfort. But nothing about this Wednesday morning was ordinary. The modifications that Judge Carol Harmon had approved transformed one corner of the room into something that felt almost incongruously gentle against the formal architecture surrounding it. A low platform had been constructed beside the witness area, not a traditional witness box, but a soft, open space at floor level, just large enough for a child and a dog to sit together comfortably. A small cushioned mat covered the platform surface. The harsh overhead lighting directly above it had been softened with a warm-toned cover that cast the space in something closer to the quality of afternoon sunlight than courtroom fluorescence. It was a small thing, that lighting adjustment, but anyone who noticed it understood exactly what it meant, that someone had thought carefully about what a 3-year-old child needed to feel safe and had done something about it. The gallery filled slowly and with unusual quiet. Word had traveled, as it always does in courthouses and in towns and in communities where people pay attention to each other's lives, and the 60 seats were occupied well before the scheduled start time by people who understood they were about to witness something that did not happen in courtrooms every day. Reporters occupied a designated section to the left. Legal observers from the District Attorneys Association were present. 2 child advocacy representatives sat near the back, and scattered throughout the gallery were the ordinary people of Franklin County, court staff, attorneys between their own cases, a retired judge who had heard about the proceedings and had come simply because 40 years in the law had given her a sense for the moments that mattered. Detective Sandra Reyes sat in the front row of the gallery. She had positioned herself there deliberately, not for any investigative reason, but because she had decided, without fully articulating it to herself, that she owed Lily the presence of a familiar face in her line of sight if the child chose to look for one. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back very straight, and her expression composed with a care that anyone who knew her well would have recognized immediately as the particular composure of someone working hard to maintain it. Marcus Webb was already at the defense table when the gallery filled. He was 41 years old and wore a dark suit that his attorney had clearly selected for him, and he sat with his arms folded and his jaw set, and his eyes fixed on the middle distance in the deliberate way of someone who has been coached on where to look and is following those instructions with conscious effort. He had not looked at the gallery. He had not looked at the modified platform in the corner. He had not, as far as anyone could observe, looked at anything in the room that might require him to acknowledge what this morning actually was and what it actually meant. His attorney, a sharp and experienced defense lawyer named Gerald Patton, sat beside him reviewing notes with the focused efficiency of someone preparing for a procedural battle. Gerald Patton had practiced law for 26 years. He had defended difficult cases. He had faced unexpected developments in courtrooms and had navigated them with the adaptability that distinguished good lawyers from merely adequate ones. He had read every document related to Lily Monroe's proposed participation and had filed every available objection and had lost every one of them. And he had arrived this morning with a strategy that relied heavily on the practical limitations of what a 3-year-old child could coherently communicate in a legal setting. It was a reasonable strategy. Based on everything he knew, it was a sound strategy. It did not survive contact with Lily Monroe. Rex entered the courtroom first, walking beside Patricia Hollies with the measured, unhurried dignity that had become his professional signature. The room watched him cross to the modified platform and settle himself onto the cushioned mat with an ease that suggested he found the courtroom entirely unremarkable as an environment, which, given his experience, he largely did. His tail moved once. He looked around the room with calm, systematic interest, and then rested his chin on his front paws and appeared to decide that everything was satisfactory. Lily entered 30 seconds later. She came through the side door with Carol Simmons, Rosa the advocate a half-step behind, Dr. Owens positioned near the wall where she could observe without being directly in Lily's line of sight. Lily was holding Bun Bun with both arms and moving with the careful, deliberate steps that Carol had come to recognize as Lily's version of courage. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward anyway, each foot placed with conscious intention, each step a small act of will. The gallery went quiet in a way that was different from ordinary courtroom quiet. This was not the procedural silence of people waiting for proceedings to begin. This was the held-breath silence of people watching something that reached past their professional composure and touched something more fundamental underneath it. Jurors who had been reviewing their notes set them down. The court reporter's hand stilled above her keyboard. Even Gerald Patton looked up from his notes, and whatever he saw on his face in that moment was something his colleagues would later try to describe and find themselves unable to do precisely. Lily's eyes moved across the room in the way they always moved across unfamiliar spaces, careful, thorough cataloging. They traveled across the gallery, across the jury box, across the judge's bench where Judge Harmon sat with her hands folded and her expression carrying the particular gravity of someone presiding over a moment they understand to be significant. And then Lily's eyes found Rex on his platform, and something in her face settled the way a compass needle settles when it finds north. She walked straight to him without hesitation. She sat down beside him on the cushioned mat, pressed her side against his warm golden flank, and rested her small hand on his back. Rex lifted his head briefly, touched his nose to her cheek with the gentleness of something practiced over 1,000 quiet sessions, and then settled again. Lily looked down at Bun Bun in her lap. The room breathed. Judge Harmon opened the proceedings with the formal language of the law, her voice carrying its customary authority across the room. Preliminary matters were addressed. Kevin Marsh made a brief statement from the prosecution table. Gerald Patton rose to respond, and his voice was measured and professional and filled the room with the cadence of legal argument that courtrooms are built for. Nobody is entirely certain afterward what specifically triggered the moment. Whether it was Marcus Webb shifting in his chair and drawing Lily's peripheral attention for the first time, whether it was something in Gerald Patton's voice, some frequency or quality that registered in the particular way that certain adult voices had registered with Lily since October. Whether it was simply the accumulation of everything, the room, the faces, the weight of the day pressing down until something inside a 3-year-old girl reached a point of absolute clarity that cut through everything else like a beam of light through a closed room. Lily's head turned. Slowly, deliberately, with the unhurried certainty of someone who has already decided what they are going to do and is simply in the process of doing it. Her dark brown eyes traveled across the room and found the defense table and found the man in the dark suit sitting with his arms folded and his jaw set and his eyes fixed carefully on the middle distance. For 3 seconds she looked at him. The room, somehow, had already begun to feel the shift, the way a room feels when something is about to happen that everyone present will remember for the rest of their lives. Then Lily's small arm rose. Her finger extended, pointing directly, unmistakably, across the room at Marcus Webb with a steadiness that made the air itself seem to stop moving. And in a voice that was clear and calm and utterly, absolutely certain, a voice that seemed too large for such a small person and yet fit her perfectly, as though she had been saving it for exactly this moment, Lily Monroe said. He was there, he scared Mama. The courtroom did not erupt. It did not fill with gasps or movement or noise. It did something far more powerful than any of those things. It went completely, totally, profoundly silent. The kind of silence that has weight and temperature and texture. The kind that presses against the walls and the ceiling and settles into the bones of everyone inside the room and stays there. Gerald Patton's objection came, eventually. Judge Harmon called for order, eventually. The machinery of the legal proceeding reassembled itself, eventually, around what had just happened and continued moving forward as it was required to do. But in that silence, in those 4 or 5 seconds between Lily's words and the first human response to them, something had happened in courtroom 4 that could not be undone by any objection, any ruling, any legal argument however skilled or thorough. A 3-year-old girl had pointed across a room and spoken the truth in a voice without a single tremor in it, with a golden dog warm against her side and a worn stuffed rabbit in her lap. Juror number 7, a middle school teacher named Barbara Ellison, pressed her hand flat against her chest and did not move it for a very long time. Detective Sandra Reyes in the front row of the gallery looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked back at Lily. Then she looked at her own hands in her lap. And Marcus Webb, for the first time since the proceedings began, looked away from the middle distance. He looked at the floor. The jury began deliberating at 2:17 in the afternoon on a Thursday in late February, filing out of courtroom 4 through the side door with the particular focused solemnity of people who have been handed something heavy and are now responsible for carrying it carefully to its proper destination. 14 people, 12 primary jurors and 2 alternates, who had spent the better part of 3 weeks absorbing testimony, examining evidence, listening to arguments from 2 sides of a case that had grown, over its duration, into something larger than any of them had anticipated when they first took their seats in the jury box. They had heard forensic analysts and character witnesses and expert testimony on behavioral psychology and the chain of custody of physical evidence collected from 412 Birchwood Lane. They had listened to Gerald Patton construct his defense with the careful architectural precision of an experienced lawyer working with the materials available to him. They had watched Kevin Marsh dismantle that architecture piece by piece with the methodical patience of someone who had built his case to last. And they had watched a 3-year-old girl point across a room and say 5 words that none of them would ever fully stop hearing. The deliberation room was a functional space, long table, padded chairs, a whiteboard, water pitchers, the particular quality of recycled air that institutional rooms develop when their windows don't open. Juror Barbara Ellison, the middle school teacher from the third row who had pressed her hand to her chest when Lily spoke, and had not been entirely certain afterward whether she would be able to continue sitting upright, was selected as foreperson within the first 20 minutes by a process that was less a formal vote than a collective recognition that she was the person in the room most capable of holding the weight of what needed to happen next without letting it tip in any direction it wasn't supposed to tip. Barbara took the responsibility with the seriousness it deserved. She organized the discussion. She made sure every voice was heard. She kept the whiteboard updated with the methodical clarity of someone accustomed to managing rooms full of people who needed information organized before they could process it. She was careful over those 11 hours to treat each piece of evidence with equal weight, to insist, repeatedly and gently but firmly, that the decision they reached had to be grounded in the full body of what had been presented, and not in any single moment, however powerful that moment had been. But in the quiet intervals, when the room paused to refill water glasses, or when someone stepped out briefly, Barbara thought about Lily. She thought about the yellow sweater with the sunflowers. She thought about the worn stuffed rabbit held in both small arms. She thought about the way Lily's hand had rested on Rex's back with such complete trust and such complete calm. And she thought about the arm rising slowly, and the finger extending, and those 5 words landing in the silence of the courtroom like stones dropped into still water, the ripples still moving outward. She was not the only one thinking about it. She could see it in the faces around the table during the quieter moments. The way certain jurors would go briefly inward, their eyes losing focus for a second or two before returning to the present discussion. Whatever else was true about the evidence in the case against Marcus Webb, and there was substantial other evidence that stood on its own considerable merit. Something had happened in courtroom 4 that had reached into every person in that jury box and rearranged something fundamental about the way they understood what they were doing and why it mattered. At 1:26 in the morning, Barbara Ellison pressed the call button and informed the court officer that the jury had reached a verdict. The notification moved through the courthouse, and beyond it in the particular way that verdict notifications move, quickly, quietly, and with an urgency that pulled people from wherever they were toward wherever they needed to be. Detective Sandra Reyes had been sitting in her car in the parking garage for 3 hours, unable to bring herself to go home, drinking cold coffee from a thermostat and reviewing case files she had already reviewed 100 times. Her phone lit up, and she was out of the car before the notification had finished loading. Kevin Marsh had been in his office on the 4th floor, jacket off, tie loosened, the particular state of suspended animation that trial lawyers enter during jury deliberations when there is nothing left to do but wait, and waiting feels like something is slowly being done to you rather than something you are doing. He received the call, put his jacket back on, tightened his tie, and walked to the elevator with his hands steady and his mind already preparing itself for both possibilities. Carol Simmons was at home with Lily, who had been asleep for 4 hours in the bedroom down the hall with Bun Bun tucked under her arm, and Rex, brought home for a special overnight stay by Patricia Hollies, who had understood without being asked that this particular night was not a night for Lily to be without him, curled at the foot of her bed like a warm, golden guardian. Carol received the text from Rosa and sat for a moment at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold, looking at nothing in particular, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her in the quiet house. She did not wake Lily. Whatever happened in the next hour, it could wait until morning. Courtroom 4 filled again at 2:45 in the morning with the slightly unreal quality that courtrooms take on in the small hours. The fluorescent lights too bright against the darkness outside the windows, the faces of the people filing in carrying the particular mix of exhaustion and heightened alertness that comes from being awake at an hour the body considers unreasonable for anything important. The gallery was smaller than it had been during the day's proceedings, but not small. The reporters were there. The advocates were there. Detective Reyes was there, back straight, hands folded, front row again. Marcus Webb was brought in from the holding area. He sat at the defense table with Gerald Patton beside him, and his arms were folded again in the posture that had become his signature throughout the trial. But something in it looked different at 2:45 in the morning than it had looked during the daylight hours. Less deliberate. More like the posture of someone holding himself together rather than projecting something outward. Judge Harmon took her seat. The jury filed in. Barbara Ellison walked to the foreperson's position with her notepad in her hand and her spine straight, and her face carrying the expression of someone who has done something difficult and done it carefully and is now prepared to stand behind it completely. She looked at the judge. She looked at the notepad. She looked up once more. On the charge of aggravated assault in the first degree, Barbara Ellison read, her voice steady and clear in the quiet room, we the jury find the defendant Marcus Webb guilty. The room absorbed it in silence for a fraction of a second. Then it moved. Not eruption, not chaos, something more complicated than either of those things, a sound that traveled through 60 people simultaneously and came out as something that was part exhale, part sob, part the involuntary release of tension that the human body performs when it has been holding something for a very long time and is finally permitted to set it down. A woman in the second row of the gallery pressed both hands over her face. A court officer near the back wall closed his eyes briefly. Kevin Marsh sat very still at the prosecution table with his hands flat on the surface in front of him, looking at nothing. Gerald Patton put his pen down. Marcus Webb stared at the table. The remaining counts were read with the same measured clarity, guilty, guilty, guilty. Each one landing in the room with the weight of something that had been a long time coming and was now, finally, irrevocably arrived. Judge Harmon sentenced Marcus Webb to 22 years in a state correctional facility 3 weeks later, in a proceeding that was formally and procedurally unremarkable, but that Kevin Marsh would later describe, privately, as the most satisfying day of his professional career. As the gavel came down for the final time, he allowed himself exactly 4 seconds of something that was not quite a smile before reassembling his professional expression and beginning the work of closing the file. Detective Sandra Reyes was already in the hallway when the courtroom doors opened. She stood with her back against the wall and her arms at her sides and her eyes closed, and for a long moment she simply stood there breathing. Her colleague Thomas, who had worked the case beside her from the beginning, came and stood next to her without speaking for a while. 20 years, she said eventually, not opening her eyes. 20 years on this job. A pause. And a 3-year-old just showed every single person in that building what it actually means to tell the truth. Thomas nodded. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would have added to it. Outside the courthouse, at a press gathering that Carol Simmons addressed briefly and gracefully on behalf of the family, a reporter asked how Lily was doing. Carol's face did something warm and complicated and entirely genuine. She thought about the little girl asleep down the hall with Bun Bun under her arm and Rex at the foot of her bed, and the quiet house around her, and the morning that was coming. She asked, Carol said, if Rex could come to her birthday party. The crowd laughed, and in that laughter, exhausted and relieved and full of something that had no precise name but felt unmistakably like the particular joy that arrives only after something very hard has finally, completely, been survived. The long and heavy story of October 14th moved one irreversible step closer to the place where it needed to go. Not the end, not yet, but the beginning of the end, and sometimes that is the most important place of all. Spring arrived in Columbus the way it always does after a particularly hard winter. Not all at once, not with dramatic announcement, but in small and quiet installments that accumulate over days and weeks until one morning you step outside and realize that something fundamental has changed, and you cannot pinpoint exactly when it happened. The oak tree in Carol Simmons's backyard produced its first pale green buds on a Tuesday in early March. The cardinal that had been visiting the feeder outside the kitchen window began bringing a companion. The light in the late afternoon stretched itself a little further each day, reaching into corners of the house that had been dark since October, filling them with something warm and unhurried and entirely without agenda. Lily noticed all of it. This was, in itself, remarkable, and Dr. Michelle Owens noted it carefully in her monthly assessment with the particular attention she gave to details that looked small from the outside but carried significant clinical weight from where she was sitting. A child in the grip of acute trauma does not notice cardinals. A child whose nervous system is locked in a permanent state of threat assessment does not stop to watch the way afternoon light moves across a kitchen floor. Noticing required safety. It required a nervous system that had been given enough consistent evidence of security to begin, tentatively and incompletely but genuinely, to stand down from its long vigil. The fact that Lily Monroe, who 4 months earlier had sat in a backyard in October with vacant eyes and one shoe, and a silence so complete it had shaken a 15-year paramedic, was now pressing her nose against the kitchen window to watch a bird, meant something. It meant something large. She had been formally adopted by Carol and David Simmons in the second week of February, 3 days before Valentine's Day, in a proceeding that was legally straightforward and emotionally overwhelming in the way that the best things sometimes are. The family court judge who finalized the adoption had presided over hundreds of similar hearings in her career and had developed, of necessity, a certain professional equanimity about them. She lost that equanimity for approximately 45 seconds when Lily, presented with a small bouquet of flowers by the court clerk as part of the courthouse's tradition for adoption finalization days, turned to Carol with complete seriousness and said, "Can we bring flowers to Rex?" The judge recovered herself. The clerk did not entirely manage it. David Simmons had come into Lily's life more gradually than Carol had, with the careful patience of a man who understood that trust, for this particular child, was not a thing that could be requested or rushed or reasoned into existence. It had to be earned in the oldest and most reliable way, through consistent presence, through the reliable repetition of small kindnesses, through being exactly what he said he was going to be every single time, without exception, without variation. He brought Lily a stuffed elephant on his 3rd visit to the house. He read her a picture book on his 4th. He learned that she preferred her apple juice in the cup with the yellow stars, and that she liked the crusts cut off her sandwiches, and that she had very specific opinions about which side of the couch was the correct side for sitting. And he honored all of these preferences with a seriousness that made Carol love him more than she had already thought possible. By March, Lily was calling him David. By April, she had started calling him something else. Quietly, experimentally, as though trying on a word to see how it fit, and David Simmons, a composed and steady man who had spent 20 years working in construction management and prided himself on his ability to remain unaffected by things that were trying to affect him, had excused himself to the garage on the afternoon it first happened, and had stood there for several minutes doing something with a piece of sandpaper that didn't particularly need sanding. The preschool on Elmwood Avenue accepted Lily in the spring session, and her teacher, a warm and experienced woman named Ms. Patterson who had been teaching 3- and 4-year-olds for 18 years, sent Carol a note at the end of Lily's 3rd week that Carol kept in the drawer of her nightstand and read occasionally on difficult days. The note said, among other things, that Lily had appointed herself the unofficial welcome committee for new students, that whenever a child arrived at the classroom door looking uncertain or afraid, Lily was somehow already there, already crouching down to eye level, already saying something quiet and specific that Ms. Patterson could never quite hear, but that invariably resulted in the new child's shoulders dropping from around their ears and their grip on their parent's hand loosening by a degree or two. "She has a gift," Ms. Patterson wrote, in the careful handwriting of someone who had learned to say important things simply. "She knows what scared looks like, and she knows what to do about it." Carol read that sentence 4 times, and then put the note back in the drawer and closed it gently. Dr. Owens continued her monthly visits through the spring and into the early summer, each one producing notes that moved progressively in the direction that good clinical notes move when the work is going well. Fewer flags, more milestones, the gradual replacement of clinical concern with something that looked, in the language of therapeutic assessment, increasingly like flourishing. Lily's speech had not only returned, but had expanded into the enthusiastic, wide-ranging, occasionally exhausting verbal output of a child catching up on lost time with considerable interest and energy. She had opinions about everything. She narrated her days. She asked questions at a rate that Carol described to David as somewhere between impressive and aerobic. She told long, elaborate stories at dinner about things that had happened at preschool, the details growing slightly more creative with each retelling in the way that only the best storytellers manage, regardless of age. She still slept with Bun Bun, but she no longer held him the way she had held him in the backyard on October 14th, fingers white with pressure, arms locked, the grip of someone holding onto the last solid thing in a world that had gone entirely liquid. She held him the way a child holds a beloved toy at the end of a good day, loosely, comfortably, the way you hold something you love when you are no longer afraid of losing it. Rex came on the second Saturday of every month. This arrangement had been Patricia Hollies' doing, organized with the quiet, determined efficiency that characterized everything Patricia did once she had decided something was important and worth the effort of making it happen. She coordinated with Carol, with the courthouse program schedule, with Rex's handler Howard Bell, who had driven down from Pennsylvania twice to observe the visits, and had come away from both occasions shaking his head slowly in the manner of someone who has spent 30 years working with remarkable animals, and is still occasionally surprised by what they are capable of. The visits followed their own rhythm, shaped entirely by Lily and Rex, and the particular language they had developed between them over months of quiet sessions in the courthouse playroom. Rex arrived, and Lily was always already at the front door, not frantically, not in the breathless way of a child who has been watching from the window for an hour, but with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly when something good was going to happen and had simply positioned herself accordingly. Rex walked through the door and Lily walked to him, and they began in the middle of things, the way old friends do, without preamble or ceremony, as though the weeks between visits had been a brief and unremarkable pause rather than a genuine absence. They went into the backyard together in the warmer months, Carol's backyard, which was nothing like the backyard on Birchwood Lane, and which Lily had made her own through the accumulation of small personal landmarks. A chalk drawing on the patio that she refreshed each week, a particular spot near the fence where she had decided a garden was going to happen, and had begun the preparatory work of moving dirt around with a plastic shovel, a low branch of the oak tree that she had identified as the correct branch for sitting, and which she had introduced to Rex on his first visit with the same formal gravity she had once used to introduce him to Bun Bun. In the cooler months they stayed inside, occupying the living room rug with picture books and the specific comfortable chaos of a child and a large dog sharing a space that is slightly too small for both of them and completely indifferent to this fact. David sometimes sat in the armchair nearby, reading a book of his own, available but unobtrusive, part of the room without being part of the session. Carol brought in tea and apple juice and occasionally sat on the couch with her own book, and for stretches of those Saturday afternoons, the house held a quality of ordinary contentment so complete and so unhurried that it felt, to anyone sitting inside it, like something that had always been there rather than something that had been assembled, carefully and imperfectly, and at considerable cost, from the wreckage of an October afternoon. Patricia Hollies had framed the photograph herself, a 4x6 print, slightly warm in its tones from the afternoon light that had come through the courthouse playroom window on the day it was taken. Lily in her yellow sunflower sweater, gap-toothed grin aimed directly at the camera, with the wholehearted commitment of a child who has decided that this moment deserves her full enthusiasm. Rex beside her, enormous and golden, his chin resting on Lily's shoulder with the comfortable familiarity of someone who belongs exactly where he is. Bun Bun visible in the corner of the frame, tucked under Lily's arm where he always was. Patricia hung it in the hallway of the courthouse where Lily and Rex had first met. The same hallway where a little girl had once walked through a door, holding 2 fingers of a foster guardian's hand and looking at the floor, and where she had walked out an hour later having found the first safe thing in her world since everything went dark. Beneath the photograph, Patricia placed a small white card in her own handwriting, the letters careful and even and deliberately chosen. Sometimes the bravest voice in the room belongs to the smallest person in it, and sometimes all that voice needed was a dog willing to listen first. Lily and Rex, Courtroom 4, Franklin County Courthouse. A reminder that healing is possible, courage is real, and love, in its most patient and unconditional form, changes everything it touches. Court staff passed that photograph every day. New volunteers stopped in front of it. Attorneys who had been practicing for decades paused beside it between cases. Occasionally, someone would stand there for a little longer than the others. A witness preparing to testify. A family navigating something difficult. A child being walked through the building by a nervous parent. And they would look at the gap-toothed girl and the golden dog in the afternoon light, and something in their face would shift, almost imperceptibly, in the direction of something that looked like courage gathering itself quietly for whatever came next. Lily never forgot Rex. She carried him with her the way we carry the things that saved us, not as a weight but as a kind of light, something that lives in the chest and illuminates the path forward even on the days when the path is hard to see. And Rex, steady, golden, unhurried Rex, who had simply walked into a room one morning and lain down on a rug and waited for a frightened child to find her way to him, had done what he had always done, in every courthouse room and every quiet session and every long and patient moment of his remarkable working life. He had shown up, he had stayed, he had listened. And it had been, as it always is, more than enough. The end.